However, since COVID and isolation, it's become very clear and evident that individuals are certainly impacted unequally across the nation and certainly across the globe. And it's certainly, you know, frustrating and it's saddening to see things happening or seeing things unravel across the nation and across the world. But equally, what's been wonderful and incredible to see is the strength and resilience among the people across the country and across the globe coming together, no longer being quiet, are unstoppable, breaking down barriers, and together fighting for anti-racism and inclusion. So truthfully, these conversations surrounding anti-racism and inclusion should and can no longer be avoided, right? Of course, this event is specific to anti-racism and inclusion within organizations. And speaking specifically to that, a lot of companies have certainly written about equity, diversity, and inclusion within policies and human resource manuals, certainly proposals. But do organizations actually know how supported their employees or their partners or their clientele that they engage with, how they feel? And how open is it really spoken about? How openly is anti-racism and inclusion spoken about at a workplace? So joining us this afternoon, we have the Jathusha Mahenthirarajan, who is the founder of L.I.G.H.T. We have Andrea Gunraj, Vice President of Public Engagement at the Canadian Women's Foundation. Christina Ranieri, the President and Executive Director of Ability First Ottawa, and Bernadeth Betchi, who is the Human Rights Policy Advisor for the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So thank you so much for joining this discussion this afternoon. So to kickstart this, I want to actually ask all of you, where did you begin engaging in anti-racism work? And secondly, how have you and even the organizations that you work for or have founded building or have built pathways to anti-racism and inclusion? So Andrea, if you'd like to kind of kickstart this.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me in this great discussion. I hope everybody can hear me. I have a voice that projects, so I'm projecting right into the speaker, but do let me know if there's any problems. In terms of my career and my background, I started in anti-racism and anti-discrimination, anti-oppression work, particularly in a community-based setting, working with youth, working with educators and youth workers, doing trainings and doing kind of workshops within school settings. And it really was grounded in the educational system. But I moved on from there to do work. I had the privilege of doing work with a lot of organizations in the for-profit sector, nonprofit sector, in the public sector, doing audits. Auditing organizations for their capacity to support safety for people of all identities, and also for looking at policy, systemic practice, training. It was with workplaces, organizations, institutions, campuses. And so that really grounded me in kind of a systemic framework. In terms of the work that I'm with now, with the Canadian Women's Foundation, I think it's really soak through everything that we do. It's in our mandate, it's in our approach. And I think that there's always a ways to go, but I think I'm very lucky and privileged to have that opportunity now.
Thanks, Andrea. Christina?
There we go. It's unmuted. Everyone can hear me? We're good? Okay. So, I mean, for us at Ability First Ottawa, I mean, we always do the same, right? We do seminars, we do education, we invite different communities in to teach our participants with disabilities and even ourselves things that we don't understand because we're not from the same culture. I do have a very diverse background in advocating. I've worked with several groups such as Indigenous, and I've been exposed to so many like wonderful cultures throughout my career. I started when I was 15 working with people with disabilities. And the biggest thing is I always find like really wonderful things that get to the point. And my favorite one is from an organization in Ottawa called Stop the Gap. They're all about accessibility and helping small businesses get wheelchair ramps. And the quote that they posted recently really got to me and really spoke volumes about this whole seminar and why it's such a good thing. You are not an ally to a minority, sorry, if you don't speak up or act with them. So for us, that's the biggest thing. I mean, it's about all of us getting together as a community and really learning and changing through each other's experiences. And that's what we embed in our organization. We want to talk about it. We don't shy away at all. In fact, some of us are pretty blunt. We just want to attain knowledge. And it's fun to learn new things. I believe someone else is speaking to this as well.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I just wanted to give you, I didn't want to kind of cut you off. Sorry. Jathusha.
Thank you again for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited for the conversations that will take place. Where did I begin engaging in anti-racism work? I mean, like everywhere. Like it's either that I engage in anti-racism work. I mean, I'm clearly racialized, so when I go into places, there's already going to be bias against me, or either I choose to engage in anti-racism work, or I allow myself to be erased in spaces and endure that. So it's a matter of survival, honestly, is why I got engaged in it in the first place. And I think it's also important to talk about who's being championed for this kind of work, because when I go into spaces and I start talking about diversity and inclusion on all sorts, whether we're talking about race, gender, age, when I start talking about these different kind of things, I mean, I'm kind of seen as somebody who's trying to change things the way that they are and not how much they want to be changed. Do you know what I mean? So in terms of like who's being penalized for championing diversity, I think that's an important lens to realize as well when we're talking about this conversation. And in terms of the organization that I run, it's a youth-led organization in York region where we train young people on and equip them to run their own social change programming. So of course we do a lot of education to these young people on, right, we're talking about mental illnesses, AODA training, anti-oppression, anti-racism, trauma-informed training. Some of these youth are working with refugee children. So how does that work, right? We're working in a lot of marginalized communities here in York region. So what does that look like? And then these are conversations that we have every day. And then so it's not like, you know, designated to one day of the week where we'll have an anti-racism like working group and we're talking about it, but something that we're incorporating every single day. And we always talk about how if we're working towards justice and liberation as a community organization, then how does that look like between ourselves as well? Like how can we work towards this vision when we don't even embody that ourselves? So what I really ask like nonprofits and community organizations whose goal is to make the world a better place and achieve, well, I'm assuming nonprofits want to achieve like justice and liberation, then if it's not even happening in your own workplace, then I don't think we're really working towards what the vision should be. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything that you've all said so far. Bernadeth?
Hi everyone, I'm Bernadeth Betchi. Just full disclaimer, I'm not feeling the greatest, and I'll try to make as much sense as possible. But where did I start? A bit like some of you have mentioned. It's by lived experiences. So I'm a Black woman. So I grew up experiencing a lot of the things that now I'm kind of working towards dismantling, even though I'm still experiencing them on a regular basis. So that's, I guess it's where it stems. It stems from understanding how other marginalized groups, how they feel, even though I maybe our form of discriminations are different. It's knowing it's knowing and not having to say, you know, I walked in your shoes, to say, you know what, I recognize that I've observed, I've recognized that there's an issue here, and I want to learn from your experience, so I can be a better ally. And I say ally, this week I was able and honored to sit, not on the panel, but to attend this webcast and to experience human and brilliant people that shared their ideas on anti-racism. And this one lady mentioned something about not being comfortable with the word ally, but instead of using the word ally, she uses the word co-collaborator or co-conspirator. I'm not sure how you conjugate that word, but which I really like, because it's not a one way. As an ally, often sometimes we can see it as I will do for you. Whereas when we use the word co, it's we're doing together. So I really liked the angle that she brought on the table, and I will use it moving forward. Or even when I use the word ally, I will make sure to also bring, you know, that understanding of, like, instead of using the word ally as okay, this is what I can do for, how can we collaborate? So when I'm actively working towards these causes, I'm doing this in knowing that we're doing this as a collective. So it started from a young age, and not even, it's interesting how we label things, but I think I've been doing the work even before I knew that the work I was doing, and a lot of us activists, it's part of our human nature, and then eventually we learned the language, and we're like, oh, this is what I was doing, and this is what I do, right? So and then interestingly enough, the education I decided to go, like, to pursue, and volunteering opportunities or working opportunities, anything really. For me, it's like I breathe social justice, I live social justice. I want to teach it to my children, like it's everywhere, it's everything, which is great, but also I think maybe I'm speaking for us as a collective here, is since when we know that, we also know that it's important for us to preserve and protect ourselves, because all these intersections of wanting to fight, but then, you know, your mental health and your physical health and all of these things can kind of take a toll. So and being aware and knowing that that's you know, we're so passionate about it, it's also important to sometimes take a step back and use and use that collective that's, you know, that are our allies to kind of do some of the work when we take a breather. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I love the co. It's amazing. I think you're absolutely spot on when it comes to that. And what I've seen, certainly a lot of organizations have recognized and are being very honest, saying that we want to incorporate this, but we just don't know how, where to start, what those strategies should even look like within our organization. So looking at that, Jathusha, Bernadeth, and Andrea, what are some of the equity-based strategies that could help organizations kind of start on the right path to anti-racism and inclusion within their organization? Jathusha, if you want to.
Sure. I guess I'll get started. I think one thing I do want to talk about is inclusion and what that means, because if it's about including me in an oppressive workplace structure, then I don't want to be included in that structure, right? And what parts of myself do I need to sacrifice in order to be included? So if for me, I want to define inclusion as being able to show up as my whole self, and then in a safe way, right? And be accepted for everything that I bring to the table. And I think in terms of like, a lot of organizations are having these conversations, but, they want to move right away into action before even looking internally within themselves. And I think that is a really, really important part. And I realize that there's a lot of people who are kind of speaking out against doing anti-racism trainings because they're more of a PR thing to make sure there's no liability. But I also want to emphasize that, anti-racism trainings that are led by BIPOC folks in a really critical manner is really important and really good. And I think, for racialized employees, talking about oppressive job environments can be hard to speak directly to white employees about it and white managers, et cetera. And having a space for us to navigate this within a safely facilitated space, I think is super important. So I do advocate for critical trainings to be invested in, to pay equipped facilitators to do that. That's like super important because there's a lot of unpaid labor that goes around, and sometimes this goes on the back of the racialized employee within the organization who decides to speak out about anti-racism, which I've been in that position too many times. And I think that, the more that you call out the elephant in the room and you talk about race, that you can create that safe space for people in the organization to share under, in an anonymous way, ways that they have experienced inequality or inequities or bias within the organization, and then also empower them and include them to be part of the solution, right? Not to design on their behalf as well. And again, like, these trainings should, in my opinion, not be mandatory, because if you're forcing people to do this and they don't really want to do this work, there's going to be a lot of other consequences. So to champion change makers within the organization willing to do the work, to re-examine processes and systems, to redesign for greater quality and inclusion. So I think it's also important to not do like unconscious bias training, because it doesn't really address the actual problems that inhibit equity and diversity and inclusion in the first place, right? You can't train bias out of people, but you can equip people to increase equity and inclusion within the workplace.
Thanks. I think what you said, Jathusha, about not forcing people and the type of setting that it should be done, I think it's very important. I've always remembered being in situations where we're in a boardroom and then there's this PowerPoint presentation and talking about, and most of the time it's probably the individual that probably should not be doing those presentations. So thank you for sharing that. Bernadeth?
I think I would like to reiterate and come back on some of the points that were just mentioned. I think it's you can't, unconscious biases are tricky, but I believe that it's important to mention and to have a conversation with people, with the basic, start our conversation with people telling them or informing everybody that we all have biases. So, and once we agree on that, and once we are aware of that, I find that it will be easier for us to move the conversation forward. So starting from that point, I find it easier to discuss, because then people will take things a little less personal. I say a little less because we tend as human beings we tend to centralize, to bring everything back to us, and then to take things to like, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that, I don't, you know, but that's often, those are not even the point. The points of those conversations are to educate and to be made aware, and to, you know, like all of these important details. So that's something I want to say about the unconscious bias part. And then inclusion, 100%. I think that's the basic. And the inclusion looks like when you're having a conversation about anti-racism, let's say specifically towards Black people, well, people at the table, most people at the table should be Black, period. There's no way, even if you've read a lot of books, or you're well educated on this subject, you know all the numbers, you have a partner who is, or whatever it is, if people that are discussed at the table are not representative of that, you know, demographic, then I find that it's almost counterproductive. Because you will have the conversation, but now when you get to the solutions, well, what then, right? You just go back to things that have been done in the past and that don't bring us anywhere. So to me, that's the basic. It's inclusion, inclusion by representation, and representation of a wide scope and a wide difference of realities. My reality is different from another Black woman, is different from another one. That's like the I guess, diversity part. So I think that that's what will I guess strengthen how inclusion has been performed or done, you know, since it's been kind of quote unquote trendy to do inclusion and diversity in organization, where I think that should have been from, like, you know, the beginning of time. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that point, Bernadette, just in terms of when you're talking about a specific matter, when you're talking about, as you mentioned, anti-racism towards Black people, or even in my sense, kind of anti-racism in terms of newcomers or new immigrants to Canada, the room should be well represented when it comes to those subject matters. Yeah, so a lot of work to be done there for sure. Thanks for sharing that. Andrea?
Thank you, folks. I really enjoyed what my co-panelists have said. I think that there's, you know, the textbook answer, I guess, might be things around HR, training, as people talked about, policy, practice, strategic plans, performance measurements, those kinds of things. I think a lot of people speak to this, but I actually look to leaders. I think leaders have a really important part to play here, because they are the ones with the power in most organizations, right? Even collectives that pretend to have no power dynamics, there's the leaders in the room, right? So I really think about, are we encouraging leaders and asking leaders to pull back and ask some very hard questions? And the questions that I would think about is, how does systemic racism interfere with our mandate and our business goals, right? Does it, or does it benefit you? I think that if you can't identify those answers, something is wrong with your mandate or your goals, and something is wrong with your understanding of your mandate and your goals. If you can't figure out how racism, systemic racism, or any kinds of discrimination interferes or facilitates it. So I think that the leaders really have to take the time to step back, as folks have mentioned, not just jump right into action. You will not identify the action you need to take. And it's just going to be surface, and it's going to be performative for the sake of marketing, for the sake of looking good. I don't know. And then the other thing I think is really important to interrogate, again, from a leadership perspective, I think that's very important. What's the incentive structure for systemic racism in your organization? What's the incentive structure for discrimination and exclusion? Why are these things perhaps rewarded? And yes, it can be unconsciously rewarded. Sometimes I think it might very well be consciously rewarded. So there's that issue that you have to grapple with as well. It's not always unintentional bias. Sometimes it's fully intentional. I think, does it allow you, these are the questions I would ask in organization, does it allow you to hire and fire with ease to be racist, to be discriminatory, to be exclusive? Does it allow you to get around labor disputes in your organization? Does it allow you to do marketing without having to think about your tough ethical practices? Does that allow you to keep some people in power, overcompensated perhaps? So they're going to be committed to the status quo, right? They're not going to want to change anything if they're overcompensated and they're doing fine. So I think you have to start there as an organization. I think it's a different conversation when you're talking about individual behavior in an organization versus organizational behavior. And I think that really is having those tough conversations, creating safety for people to be able to say that where they're in parts of the organization that they don't have power and that they can be penalized for saying things. I think they have to really think about what are the unpopular decisions they'd have to make, the financial implications that come from those unpopular decisions, and the workplace shifts that would have to happen. That's why it's so hard to do, I think. And I think it's especially hard to do outside of the hot button moments. You know, maybe right now we're in a hot button moment. So we're acting like it can be done, but I think it's actually very difficult to do because that's what status quo is like. It's resilient. And especially in a complex organization, a well-established organization that has a lot of people in it. I'm thinking not the organizations under 50. I'm thinking 500 people, 1,000 people. When you start getting to that scope and that scale, I think it starts getting really difficult to do internally. And I think that the standard actually has to come from outside of the organization, not inside the organization. And I think that's really around legislation. That's what's important. That's not just about remedies, like solving things after the fact, but being proactive about reporting on this stuff, doing this work, and that there's a financial punishment when you don't do it. So really, I'm speaking from that organizational perspective that is really big, really overwhelming, and super difficult to do. And I might be just in that place in life where I'm thinking that the fact that we're in this moment, I think we're going to get a lot of equity trainings. I don't know necessarily, without pushing really hard continually, that we're going to get to these organizational structure pieces just automatically.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Andrea. I guess it's one of everyone essentially in some form or another kind of brought this up in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then, Andrea, you brought it from a perspective of not just looking at your policies and strategies, but looking beyond that. So Christina, I want to kind of add you to this this ask here. What is the importance of having equity, diversity, and inclusion to be human-centered as well?
Well, the thing is that as humans, we all have unique needs. And individuals' needs should always be considered. That's how you create a safe space. And trying to implement a one-size-fits-all is just setting you up for failure. It's never worked in the past, and it never will work now. But it's easier on paper, sadly, is the route people go. There's always room for improvement. There's always strategies to develop. There's always getting people to not only participate, but to be heard. So a lot of the time how I look at it is, it's a quote from Defina Lazarus Stewart. It's a little long, but it's really a great way to start the conversation, I find. And in my case, my organization is centered around persons with disabilities and their families. Their abilities are everywhere, so it asks them the questions to help them reflect. So diversity says, who's in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat? Inclusion asks, has everybody's idea been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? Diversity asks, how many more of picking any marginalized identity group do we have this year than last? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here. Inclusion asks, is the environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice challenges, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimalized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views?
Oh.
It
Thanks
almost,
for sharing that. Yeah.
it's, I actually do use it when we talk about it with our participants with, you know, developmental disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, physical disabilities, just to get them thinking and asking the questions that if they ever felt that something, even in like bringing it to our attention, bringing it to others, and also when we're doing policies and procedures, sitting down and just asking those questions. Who is the person who isn't being heard? What can we do to hear them? What can we make sure to do to add participation? Which I like that everybody is definitely on the same page about, because there's no point in inviting someone to a table and not letting them speak.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Christina. I think a lot of us have certainly been in those situations where you are invited to the table, but it's more of a, I'm going to talk at you and not ask you for kind of your thoughts and your opinions and whatnot. So thanks for sharing that. That was amazing. Andrea, you kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of inclusion. I think everyone has. I certainly feel as though, like, in order to foster inclusion, diversity absolutely does need to be at a highest priority with organizational practices and standards, and that includes the leaders that have those high impactive or high roles where they do kind of control those aspects. Certainly from recruitment to hiring to the policies that they write, talking about kind of organizational culture. A lot of companies do require some form of strategy that does cultivate an inclusive workplace or environment. So, and I think, Bernadeth, you said this earlier, is don't rush into action. How much thought have you really put into reflecting on where the gap is within your current organization? But at the same time, Andrea, you kind of touched on this a little bit. How can organizations hold themselves accountable to inclusive corporate culture? And how can organizational culture be more inclusive? So Andrea, if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you. I think I take a step back and I think about what is culture. And I look at culture as things like the shared norms, ideas, standards, what we like, what we don't like as a group, what we laugh at, stories we tell about ourselves and who we are. So when I think about that, I think also that the fact that there's cultures within cultures, right? So the culture of a workplace is a small reflection of and can be different than the broader culture. So workplace is a secondary culture in a sense, but I think it has a profound influence on our lives. Obviously, we spend so much of our time often in a workplace environment. So I think that when I think about culture and making culture more inclusive, more just, I think about the project of culture breaking and culture making. It has to be both. So culture breaking and culture making can be things around skill building, like training. It can be creating standards and shifting standards. I think about performance reviews. I think about metrics. If that's not integrated into the way that plans, these diversity and inclusion and equity plans are developed, then there's no standard to live up to and nobody to be accountable. And really, organizations ultimately are made up of people, right? There's also things like marking issues that, you know, can be celebrations, acknowledgements in a workplace, in a secondary culture. And I think then that makes culture making and breaking within organizations and workplaces quite difficult, right? It's not an easy project. It has many sides to it and many interlapping features. But I think if you're not a learning organization, if your organization is not one where people knowledge and sharing knowledge all the time, this is going to be hard. Culture making and breaking becomes hard. If your practices aren't really conducive to collective learning and collective wellness, it's going to be hard. So I think the project of, making cultures less unjust becomes a bigger workplace issue as well. You have to have the kind of culture that allows you to learn together, challenge one another together, challenge power, be in kind of a collective space together where people at all levels are learning together and challenging. If you don't have that, then you're not going to get to the harder project of promoting justice. So I think that it's actually a very all-encompassing, all-shifting, all-changing thing. And too often, I think we relegate diversity and inclusion, and I really dislike those terms. I think they're off, but whatever, we'll use them. Diversity and inclusion, when we make that project our sole project, we forget all the conditions around that have to be changed and have to be improved to even allow that conversation to happen in the first place. So I think that the culture question is a great question, and it's a big one.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for sharing that. Bernadette?
I think I also want to build on something Andrea just mentioned, that that word, she said something, she used the word accountability. And so we need to start holding people accountable, especially organizations that that expose or present themselves as being, we want to change makers. We want to be, again, those words like inclusive and diverse and all of these things. Well, okay, so then we'll hold you accountable for using these words, and we'll hold you accountable every step of the way in this process of changing cultures, because like you said, there's so many layers in culture. There's like you said, cultures within cultures, and that's just talking about the workplace. I'm not even talking about everything else. And another way to dismantle that and to dismantle the resistance in so many people, how so many people are afraid or resist change is by, again, going back to holding them accountable and I guess bringing an intersectional is one of my favorite words. I use it for everything, but an intersectional lens in in analyzing, in the way we analyze, the structure in place in the organization, what's considered the norm, what are people doing that that are wrong, that is wrong, what are the norms that are actually counterproductive to change, all of these things. So yeah, going back and stripping everything down to accountability and holding people accountable, especially, I mean everybody, but especially all of these organizations that say, yeah, we want to change and we're doing things to change our culture and to be more inclusive and more diverse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you in terms of accountability. I feel like it's become a term that a lot of organizations are using because it makes them look good as part of their responsibility, under quotations. And you're absolutely right. There needs to be something put in place where they are actually called out and saying, listen, this is what you claimed, or that you mentioned that you're making changes towards. How is it being actioned, or has this been actioned out yet? Because I haven't seen anything. So absolutely spot on with that. So I'm very curious to know, I can't wait to hear about this. Andrea, Jathusha, and Christina, can you tell me a little bit about how the Canadian Women's Foundation and Jathusha L.I.G.H.T and I believe First Ottawa, how are you kind of tackling this head on when it comes to inclusion and anti-racism?
Could you repeat that? My earphone cut out a little bit.
Sure. I'd love to hear more about how Ability First Ottawa is tackling anti-racism and inclusion. And I presented that question to Jathusha and Andrea as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I thought maybe it was this. So when I talk, I believe we're talking more about like hiring practices, correct?
No, in general, just in general.
I mean, in general, I would just say that, so, you know, to include all groups, in general, what it's a very interesting thing. How we tackle it is, we're just very blunt. We want to talk about more. And when we talk about things like, I'm going to kind of gear it more towards like employment, because that's where a lot of our groups see this, right? And with Ability First, we are a volunteer organization, but we still look into all of this when we're hiring volunteers. So for me, the best practice is transparency. And that a person should be made aware of barriers that could block them from attaining employment or a volunteer role. And if a person, due to their lack of resources, facing barriers to getting employment, then it's the employer's responsibility to address and remove those barriers. An example would be if an employer or says that they're looking for a certain demographic, it's okay to say you're looking for that demographic, or that person's knowledge in different cultures, because that way you're going to get the right people. And we want more representation of the right people teaching the right information so that everyone can learn. And a lot of the time when I believe Andrea was talking about like the way there's a negative impact when change is happening, I think the best way to explain that is accountability always feels like an attack when you're not ready to acknowledge how your behavior hurts others. But sadly, people don't see it that way. They see it as an attack first. So it's kind of the reflection of, until they realize that when they're being held accountable, and even though they feel attacked, they must realize that they don't know the knowledge in order to see what harm is being done. And reflection and transparency is key on that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Christina. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that it's okay for organizations to admit that they don't know what the first step or the steps should even look like. And I'm really glad that you brought up the hiring practices, because there is a lot of untapped talent and potential that unfortunately is not recognized. And that could just be because due to fear of not wanting to even start that conversation of where that could lead their organization, or just because of, as you mentioned, not recognizing that one doesn't truly understand how to meet the needs of individuals. And I think it even comes down to, as you mentioned earlier, the language that you use that goes down to like a job posting even, right? Yeah, so thank you so much for bringing up that point. Jathusha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina, for talking about those really important points. I think within L.I.G.H.T is also a volunteer-run organization as well. You know, there's an illusion of inclusion just when there's numbers met for diversity, right? That's another huge problem. So for us, even if we are meeting like diversity benchmarks and targets, we're not going to assume that it's an inclusive place, and we actively every day work to build that inclusive.
And so that's, I think that's really important. And simply hiring racially or just diverse candidates is not enough when you're putting them in a space that is not safe for them, and where racism or other forms of oppression are still prevailing in that workforce, right? So, for example, we know that racial prejudice could lead to lower salaries, fewer promotions, you know, lower performance evaluations for people of color. So I know within my own experience, I've had some of the successes that I've had in the workplace attributed to other employees who are white, instead of me being able to get the recognition for my own work. And so how can you help your employees or your volunteers feel secure and satisfied with their jobs by creating safe spaces for them where they can discuss their concerns and have that accountability mechanism, and they know there's a confidential avenue for them to be able to do so. And in terms of strategies, try to, especially in the hiring process, going back to what Christina was talking about, I think try to reduce as many bias interrupters as you can, right? Whether it's removing name from the applications, or I know that when I do interviews, I actively take notes so that I don't just go based on like, what is my impression of this person? Because you know what I mean? I go based off the information that I have written down. So I write down during interviews. I also make sure that we try as much as we can and to completely eliminate referral hiring, right? When people are referred, and then to choose them based on that. Don't ask for more qualifications than required, right? And list on the job position as a young person. That is super important to a lot of young people. When we're looking to apply to jobs, it feels impossible because even when we make it to the interview stage and then we're questioned about things that weren't even on the job interview, it just makes it ridiculous and impossible to access these jobs. And talk about how are we meeting these qualifications instead that are on the job application. And importantly, like I think like we live in a data-driven world, so collect the data, analyze the data so you can hold yourself accountable and work towards reducing and eliminating barriers.
Thanks, Jathusha. I think one of the things I can certainly relate with during that time earlier in my career when I was applying to things, some things I just wouldn't even apply to because of 12, 13 different supposed qualifications, 5 to 10 years experience you supposedly must have had. I mean, why do I even bother? I'm probably not going to get a call back or anything like that. So I can totally relate to kind of the hiring practices that way. Andrea?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the Canadian Women's Foundation, we are focused on philanthropy, right? Being a public foundation, Canada's public foundation for women and girls, and everybody affected by gender inequality. That includes trans, two-spirit, non-binary people as well. And the way that really a big part of our work is feminist philanthropy, the way we frame it, right? Trying to move money from people who have money at all levels of what that looks like, move it to the grassroots, doing this work, doing this gender equality work. And we know that sector is really, really underfunded compared to everything else, right? It needs it. So it's about who we fund and what we fund and how we fund. I think all tackles anti-racism and inclusion and justice, gender justice, racial justice, all the forms of justice. One of the things that I just saw today is that 30% of the organizations that we funded recently are going towards Indigenous-led and focused organizations. That's one of the ways that we try to make sure that we're just making sure the money goes to the unexpected places, the places that unfortunately don't get the funding they deserve to do the good work that they're doing. How we operate as well too, I think is a very important part, and that's more internal. That's our strategic plans. That's how we measure, like how we measure success and what we see as success. That's our internal practice and policy work, and that influences everything that we do, whatever we do, public facing and internal as well. It really is our policy work. We've got a strong voice in the public, and I think the way we use that voice is very important, and we better use that voice to tackle all these things. We better use this voice to address justice in all its many forms, and particularly now, you know, it's the moment to speak up about lots of different forms of oppression, but certainly anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism top of mind, and thought leadership. really trying to lead the way, bring up the unexpected conversations, the unexpected narratives that get suppressed, that don't get listened to, the voices that are speaking but just don't get listened to, right? And then it's also about who we are, growing our diversity in our team. And certainly I must say that I've, in my career, had the strange and unusual privilege of working with women of color my whole career. Racialized women my whole career. Most of my bosses, my leaders have been racialized women, in particular Black women. And I've learned so much about everything from these incredible women who knew what they were talking about, understood how you do this work in community at all levels of government, at all levels of community. And right now, the Canadian Women's Foundation, we have a president and CEO who's a Black woman. And we also have a board chair who's a Black woman. And we have more and more Black women, people of color, Indigenous women, people who just do not get leadership positions. Those things are blocked to them many times. You know, we might get food sometimes depending on where we live, but you know, in Toronto, I think we're in a bit of a bubble. When you look at the way the sector is laid out, it's by and large white, cisgender, heterosexual. It's like, you know, very monocultural, and that is part of the problem. So I think that part of the solution, of course, is what people are talking about, that hiring and who's in your leadership, because your leaders will hold you accountable. So if your leadership doesn't have a perspective on this and maybe doesn't know even how to approach it and think about it, you will be impacted. So I have to say that the Canadian Women's Foundation are very proud of that, and it is a rarity. And at the same time too, we can do more.
Thanks, Andrea. I know that we've spoken about this a little bit earlier in our conversations, just specific to training. So, I don't like the term sensitivity training. It's something that's always been brought up since the beginning of when I started my career. But at the same time, whenever kind of, just from my personal experience, whenever kind of programs or projects start, there's always this thing like, oh, you know what, we should probably arrange for some sensitivity training because I don't really know how to handle these programs or projects. I guess my question is, what is the importance for companies to not wait and educate themselves about intersectionality, and how can they incorporate it within their own organization? Where, like, what would that even look like? So I guess Jathusha or Andrea, if you want to kickstart that.
Could you rephrase that question?
Sure. So kind of specifically talking about kind of training, diversity and inclusion training, or anti-racism training, what I've kind of been a witness to is, well, we're going to kind of wait until someone kind of comes in the organization to kind of train us on this before we kind of take the next step within an organization. Can you tell me what is the importance of companies saying, you know what, like, I'm not going to wait, I'm going to start educating myself. We don't have to have these boardroom meetings and have these PowerPoint presentations and go through each bullet point. You know, how do you, recognize this or whatnot? So what is the importance of companies educating themselves?
I mean, there's always the business case for diversity, inclusion, equity, which I think we should start moving away from, and we should start moving towards a moral case towards it. I think it's important because microaggressions in the workplace, like forms of oppression, impact your employees directly, which impact their health and, the emotional, physical, psychological tax that it takes on our bodies has huge repercussions for the organization itself, right? So how can you support your employees to do the best work that they can as well, right? And I want to recognize that there's, a lot of capitalistic notions and ideas behind that as well, right? And when we're talking about productivity and getting as much work as you can out of employees, I think that is also harmful to frame it in that mindset. I think, why is it important for companies to care about intersectionality? Because it's 2020, you should be caring about it, and it is imperative that organizations are creating a context in which all people, regardless of the different intersections of their identity, can realize their full potential and can access resources and opportunities that, you know, they weren't historically able to access for a multitude of reasons.
Thanks. I think what's been very clear, even with COVID and isolation, a lot of our homes have been transitioned into workplaces. And at the same time, a lot of people have been laid off with COVID, right? So one of the most frustrating and saddening things is that where I see situations where single mothers do have children and schools are closed and they're being completely looked over by a lot of opportunities across organizations. And the same thing even when it comes to persons with disabilities, right? So it's just in terms of looking at hiring practice, I know Christina, you spoke about this a little bit, based on how things are being run with COVID and isolation, there's a lot of room for practices to be shifted, especially with organizations that have permanently transitioned remote. What are the methods of practice that needs to be put in place based on our new norm, I guess I should say, to ensure inclusivity?
Well, I mean, the biggest challenge that persons with disabilities face when hiring is whether they disclose or not disclose, because sadly the culture is you get punished when you disclose, you get punished when you ask for accommodations, and most of the time that will dictate whether you get hired or not. I don't know many workplaces where people have to pay for their work equipment, even though they need it in order to be safe, to do their job correctly, is a big issue in the disabled community. I see often that, yet recently actually, that our community is being reached out to better understand our barriers and our socioeconomic struggles. What I'm not seeing as much as I'd like is they need to take the opportunity to listen and learn from our groups of all different graphic of groups, not just the person with disabilities community. But the thing that I do see is that if they're seeking advice and information from these communities, they need to give them the respect of paying them for their services and advice. And this needs to be with the intent of making sure individuals get the accreditation and recognition for their services so that they can be better represented in the community. It's a sign of respect. There is many times where, I have to say, the disabled community, we are advocates. We volunteer a lot. I have never seen in my years, even with someone who can't physically move, not volunteer. And the thing is that all these years, companies' biggest excuse for not hiring us or accommodating us was, well, we can't accommodate you to work 2 days a week at home. So obviously, COVID has ripped that veil and has shown that was an excuse all along. There are tons of very well-educated people in my community who are stuck in poverty due to barriers. You'll notice I've been using a lot of quotes, and the reason I have is also to hit everybody's points, right? And another one I saw was, even though this was also anonymous, but it's a fantastic quote. Crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. And right now, COVID has brought us all together as a community in every diverse, every type, and this is the greatest time for us to create positive change together, because it has brought so much that has been hidden from all of our communities. I would list them all, but I do have an incision on my face, so it would hurt my face a lot. It's time. It is 2020. There is no excuse anymore. It's time to stop hating people for being different. I have seen beautiful people over my years of careers where the situations that have been created to oppress has led to them taking their lives. And it needs to stop. It needs to stop right now. So I'm really glad for this opportunity to meet all of you and to talk with you, because we need to have these conversations and they need to be addressed, listened, and respected. Which Jathusha, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong, when you brought up the point of, you know, people who are supposed to be teaching these classes are not what I see, this is how I phrase it, is they're not being respected by being given proper pay for their expertise. Any other person with expertise gets paid. And that's how I view it, where I understand small organizations may not be able to do something like that, but there's a way to do it. You need to show mutual respect, and showing that respect is either sometimes is paycheck, it's how can we, you know, how can I help you reach your goals? Do you need a support letter? What do you need? Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Sorry, Bernadeth, did you have anything to add? Sorry, I just saw you.
Yeah, I
Okay.
wanted to build on what Christina said and everybody else. There's so when we're first hit by COVID, and organizations were making arrangement, and they were working night and day to accommodate everybody to be able to work from home. There's a few tweets so I work in human rights, and there's a few articles and tweets that I read that were kind of I guess calling out the hypocrisy or of that, especially for people like Christina said, people with disabilities, where they had been asking this for years and years and years. And, you know, we can do the work. We can do the work from home. We are going to work from home. This is what we're asking you, maybe not 5 days a week if you really don't want to, but 2 days a week, whatever it is, we will take it, because we know we have so much to bring to the table. And then we have the skills and everything. And it was always received with, well, no, well, we can't do it, and all the excuses in the book. And I remember after having kids, how I would sometimes present myself, like if I started a new job, even before being hired, at the interview, okay, this is my situation. I have young children. I appreciate if you give me a few days where I can work from home, because look, for logistic, it works better for me. And it always received with judgment and like, you know, this, well, is she going to be productive? What are you going to do at home? And then COVID hit. And then now, like I love the quote that Christina shared about how, like, you know, it's just revealing it's the hypocrisy or whatever it is. Like now people will, they won't have an excuse anymore to say, well, no, we can't really accommodate you. And if they do, you will understand what they're telling you, really. And so that's something that this pandemic brought forward, and I'm almost thankful for at least that aspect of it all, in terms of like, there's a lot of things that we can do from home, and a lot of us, and I'm just going to speak for myself as a woman, as a mom, how there's a lot of things that I was refused and not considered for, or I was discriminated against my family status because I have children, and yeah, maybe that will be too much, or like whatever it is. Now it can't be, and it will be clear, crystal clear, what the message is if people come forward with that excuse. And there's so many things I wanted to say, and I forget, and I wanted to have a pen and a paper to write, but I don't, obviously, because there's like a lot of powerful things that are being said. But one thing I wanted to bring forward, and I don't know if it's a good time to do it, but I'll just do it, is that there's a lot of conversation happening. People come to you. Oh, one thing before I go to that emotional labor that we are performing and we're not being paid for is exhausting. So I see a lot of people, and I know some people don't do it, to on purpose, or that's not the intention, but there's experts that are paid hourly for their brilliant minds and what they have to share. And then a lot of us, we are approached and we're asked to do for free often. And or not even, and like all the other panelists said, sometimes there's ways to work around it, but those ways to work around need to be discussed. You need to, when someone approaches you for your knowledge, a knowledge that that they don't have, that person needs to come to you and say, I acknowledge what I'm asking you and what you will give me, and this is what I can or cannot do. It needs to be transparent. And it's not always our responsibility as the person who's being approached to be like, hey, can you please, and can like pay or whatever, because preparing to go and discuss about these topics, even though you've been doing for years and years and years, it takes time, and it takes you need to take into consideration all of the years, where the formative years to come to that, the knowledge, or the knowledge that the person has. So that's another thing I find that it touches a lot of it usually weighs heavier on marginalized groups, where it's just we do and for free. And so that last thing I wanted to add is there's a lot of conversation. So we're discussing a lot, and often organizations, to show that they're moving forward and they're active and they're listening, will call more meetings and more discussions, and let's discuss again and share your experience again and again and again. So it's like asking someone that maybe has experienced something very traumatic, because we know, and it's been discussed here, everything, all these microaggressions or whatever that's happening in our lives have a repercussion on our mental health, emotional health, and all of these things. So it's asking me, Bernadeth, okay, can you tell me again, your experience as a Black employee, and how blah blah. And so it's me going back to that wound, and like going back to the time, like all of these heavy and difficult and whatever times where I've experienced microaggression, I've experienced racism, I've experienced sexism, I've experienced ageism, all of these things. So it's so don't be surprised if sometimes employees or people are not open to discussing, because discussing can be very heavy. And especially discussing when you've been discussing for years and then you see that nothing is happening. We're just discussing. Here, let's discuss again. So when you approach your employees or your coworkers or whomever, and you see that they're a bit resistant in wanting to share again, because trust me on this, it's not the first time. You need to understand where they're coming from. You're asking them to re-experience that trauma again and again and again. And then they're not even sure that you will do something concrete with that experience. It's good to listen, but we need to be actively listening and actively doing something, because then it will create less and less people wanting to share, because they'll be like, well, what's the point, right? I'm just re-experiencing this, but then what? Like my story, which is very important on the research scale, like you have the qualitative, which is the storytelling, and you have the quantitative, like all these numbers. Yes, the story is important, but then we need to do something with that story. We can't just say that we listened because it's part of it's you know, it's a good thing to say. So I would add that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. I can certainly relate on so many levels with what you said, Bernadette. I've certainly experienced times where I'm like, yeah, I'm done. I don't want to repeat myself, as you mentioned earlier, over and over again, because nothing is obviously being done about it. So I think it definitely comes back to the accountability that we spoke about, okay, fine, I'm trusting you with my story. I'm sharing this to you because I feel like I'm trusting you in this. What are you going to do? Like, what is going to happen after this conversation? I think it's a very blunt ask. I think, Christina, you said that before, being blunt. I think it's very blunt for us to start asking that as well. So I'm just looking at the time. I know that we're running out a little bit. I just want to ask this last question, and I'm going to open it to everyone to kind of share their thoughts and ask questions. In your opinion, what needs to happen from, I guess, government level when it comes to anti-racism and inclusion? And at the same time, how can organizations, whether you're a part of an organization or you founded the organization, how can organizations help achieve whatever that is as a first step? So anyone can chime in. Bernadette, Jathusha, Christina.
I was just wondering if you guys, I was just wondering if the two other ladies would be able to speak first, just to
Sure.
give my face a little bit of a rest.
Sure. Andrea, if you don't mind.
Sure, I didn't hear you, Christina, and I thought, oh no, she doesn't know that her microphone is down, is up, okay, no problem. So for me, I think that, as I mentioned before, I think legislation is really important. It's an important tool that the government can use. The government only has a few tools. Legislation is a big one. And it's not just about remedial legislation, so like punishing after something bad has happened, but also proactive. So asking organizations, particularly those that are getting funded by the government, but also those who just participate in the system that the government runs, and that's capitalism for you, that we have to really report on the progress annually, and that there are repercussions for non-compliance or poor performance. And I think that that is like right from the top, federal government type of things, but I think then every level of government has to reproduce those same standards and be able to hold organizations and companies to it. I think also governments, you know, another tool besides legislation is tax. The way they allocate tax, that they have to do it in a way to dismantle discrimination and barriers. And this is a colonial structure that we're living in, right? So that's a huge dismantling that has to happen. It's from childcare, it's policing, it's prisons, it's schools, it's housing, it's shelter, from social services to the public sector. Like, we cannot think that anything is outside of that tax allocation. It's all tax in some way. So if the government were to do those two things, I think that might very well shift a lot, but it's not the only. I think about data collection to track progress. People have been talking about, especially in this COVID relationship that, or reality that we're living in, why race-based data, for instance, is not being collected. This is a matter of course for the government and for institutions to not, in Canada, collect race-based data. In the States, because there, you know, there's a lot of things that we accuse the states of being bad at, but race-based data is actually something that they do better than Canada, I believe. And why aren't all our systems, again, that you and I are paying for, why aren't our data being collected and then being held to performance measures? So I think a lot of things hide because data is not collected, and therefore not, what's not counted is not seen, is not corrected. And then I think about, of course, the changed makeup of the government. People talk about having more representation, right? And seeing yourself reflected in representation. I think that's very important too. I think that does improve democracy and democratic institutions. I think it improves civic participation and inclusion. But I really resist when people are just talking about the face of government or the face of leadership alone, and not thinking about the structures that need to change. And I'm really, for me, it's legislation, it's tax, it's data. Those are the three big things.
Thanks, Andrea. Bernadette?
I'm just going to focus, and I think they're excellent ideas. And I'm just going to focus on the race, on the data collection. And just to tell you a story, I remember when I was doing my master's degree, so I focused on the reproductive health and the issues between there's just a lot of data or information that suggests that women of color or Black women have a higher rate of mortality, and the way they're treated, right, and when they're pregnant and the aftercare and all of that. And in doing my research, I had the hardest time finding data from Canada. Everything that I was finding was from the States. And that's a huge gap. So that's why I wanted to reiterate that point about, data. We need we need the data, especially in a society where that's something that we value so much to justify everything. Well, so then collect the data so we have the numbers, so we can, we can finally show on paper, this is what we've been saying. We're not dreaming, this is happening, here are the numbers, but then the numbers are not here, they're not there. So yeah, I would echo everything that Andrea just mentioned, and then just kind of reiterate the race, especially since COVID, that's something that we've been hearing a lot, like we don't have the data to back up all of the things that we're talking about.
Thanks, Bernadette. Jathusha, did you want to chime in? Do you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I think both Bernadette and Andrea really touched upon the really important points of data collection and having, the proof that legislative policy changes is something huge the government can do, and then tax, right, as well. I think another component that we need to consider is how much the government is interacting with community organizations, like people on the ground. I think that's another aspect in this fight for, justice and liberation and equity. They need to be talking and in consultation with and working with and, respecting the labor and paying for the labor of those community organizations. I also think that, there's a long way to go in terms of what the government has to do. There's already so many suggestions out there. And for example, the 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada hasn't even been implemented yet, right? So when we're talking about what can the government do, it's not like it's not already there. The labor has been put. So many people have released recommendations. It's there. They're just not implementing it. So now there's no we don't know what to do. It's what you have to do, but you're just refusing to do it, and put your money where your mouth is at.
Can I add one thing from what you just said? It's interesting because in the webcast that I attended this week on anti-racism, this professor from Nova Scotia, and I forget his name, I just want to take all his courses because he was so passionate and, it was amazing. So I want to learn from him, but he was saying, I think it's in 2017, there was a report done on anti-racism, and with, again, all the recommendations and everything. And he says, that's it. We're done with doing studies. We're done with, working more like commissions and doing more report and studies. We have the recommendations. You've heard from the people. You've studied it. Now you need to do the work. So he says, now it's time to do the work. In 2017, and we're in 2020, and we still haven't seen anything. So you're totally right in that we do have everything that we need. We're equipped. We can continue conversation, but now it needs to be active. It needs to be, okay, so we did this, what's next? But in actively doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Bernadette. Love it. That's awesome. Christina, are you okay to share your thoughts, or?
Yes.
Oh, gotta.
Sorry. I still get used to this thing. Well, with all the levels of government, like I did touch on it earlier more, but I think the biggest thing is, you're right, data collection. I mean, I've been in this field for so long when it comes to persons with disabilities, and there is barely any real research on it. Like I remember I would be doing reports. I'm in college and university, and I couldn't find anything. Like I would really have to dig to find any studies to, and a lot of the studies and a lot of the researchers also weren't from my demographic. It was very surreal when I started post-secondary, because I didn't see anybody really like me, and I didn't see that representation of I always put disability leadership when I do hashtags or accommodations or rights, because I'm always trying to push the point that I want to see that more. I want to see people and other groups be represented in government, be represented in schools. I want to see books where more like kids' books, where they talk about all the inclusion and diversity and all the different types of families. I think that with all the data we have now, it's just time to, you're right, everyone is, it's at the point now, not only there has to be action, but it's also, you have to take that action and then catch everybody up who would have maybe missed that opportunity to learn about all of our group's histories. I do know that in schools, they do not teach about disabled history. The only part they do teach about is about eugenics. They touch on it, about how, you know, it wasn't that long ago, about 20, 30 years ago, that people like me would be sterilized and we would never see our families and put in an institution. And it didn't matter what kind of disabilities you had. It could be anything, but that was the treatment. And a lot of people are shocked by that. When I say that, I'm like, it wasn't that long ago. And in all of our cases, it wasn't that long ago that women got rights. It wasn't that long ago that persons from the GLBTQ community got the right to marry. It wasn't that long ago. But now I think that it's almost like everybody's catching up. So now it's time to almost make it so mainstream that we don't miss anybody. We don't miss the seniors in the retirement homes. We don't miss the kids. We don't miss the teenagers. We teach everybody. We find them all opportunities to learn, because then how do we expect governments or policies or procedures to reflect change